Hello, everyone. This is Dominique Gomez from the Salazar Center at Colorado State University. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first conservation conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about climate change and conserving biodiversity and the Convention on Biological Diversity's 30 by 30 goal. Today is the first of a collaboration of 9 university centers that is going to work to highlight solutions in climate conservation and environment and hopefully identify specific policies, programs, and strategies to help secure the long-term health of the nation's natural resources, wildlife, and landscapes, and most importantly, broaden the benefits for all Americans. And we hope that you will join us on many of these conversations. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so we will provide a link to that recording to all people who registered within the next couple of days. All attendees are on mute, but we would love to hear your questions. So please submit those questions throughout the webinar through the question box on the control panel. And we hope that you register for upcoming webinars and learn more about the series at conservationconversations.org. With that, it is my pleasure to pass this off to our first host, John Jarvis of the Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity at the University of California at Berkeley. John, thank you so much, and I will pass the presenter role off to you.
Okay, thank you, Dominique, and welcome everybody. As Dominique indicated, the University of California, Berkeley is the host for this first in a series of webinars. And we are an institute that's fairly new, a couple of years old, and we've been focusing on sort of bringing science to the management of parks and protected areas. We're looking at new models of governance for parks and public lands. We've been working on equitable access to parks and public lands, and we are working to train a new generation of conservation leaders. And I served as the inaugural executive director. I now serve as the chairman of the board. Okay, we need to move a slide here. I served 40 years with the National Park Service and was the 18th director. And as you can see, I knew what I wanted to do early in my career. And we have 3 panelists who will be speaking today, 3 very distinguished individuals. Justin Brashears is a professor here at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's been focusing on the dynamic relationship with wildlife and the conservation of biodiversity, and with hopefully developing some policy framework for the conservation of biodiversity, and has been working specifically on the 30 by 30 goals. Patrick Gonzalez is the associate adjunct professor also here at UC Berkeley, but he's also the principal climate scientist with the U.S. National Park Service and is a lead author with the IPCC report on climate change. And then Jane Rogers is the Chief of Science and Resource Stewardship at Joshua Tree National Park. She is a recognized leader in climate adaptation, has been working for the Park Service for several decades, and is doing some really interesting work at adapting Joshua Tree itself to climate change. Our topic today really is about how we take the goals of the Convention of Biodiversity around protecting 30% of the land base of each country by 2030 and put some effectiveness into that to understand how we can best protect biodiversity while at the same time creating new protected areas. An analysis that I worked on with a team in 2016 found that in the United States, we are currently at about 12% of our land base is in some form of legal protection. So if we're going to move from 12% to 30% by 2030, there are a lot of really interesting questions about which land should be protected, how will they most be effectively protected, and how do we ensure that they are conserving biodiversity at the same time. So we're going to have the 3 panelists speak for about 10 minutes each, Justin first, then Patrick, then Jane. And then it'll be open to questions. So please submit your questions. I have a few myself, and then we hopefully will have a dialogue to finish out this webinar. So with that, I'll pass it to Justin for the first presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. And I want to keep us on time, so I'm going to try and dive right in if and when I'm able to share my screen here. So hopefully that's working okay. So let me first just say quickly, thank you, John, and thank you to the organizers for including me in this conversation, conservation conversation. I'm sure I'm going to mess that up at some point. But I wanted to just say that I'm really going to, sorry, I somehow got ahead on where I'm supposed to be. So I really wanted to just say I'm really going to emphasize or take to heart the conversation part of this process, and that is I'm going to bring up far more questions today than I have answers, and that can be frustrating, but I think it's the state of our situation regarding large-scale conservation and specifically the 30 by 30 initiatives. And over the last year or so, I've had the fortune and at times misfortune of being involved in different groups, both academic, nonprofit, and engaging federal and state policy folks to try and think about how we take the incredible energy around this 30 by 30 initiative, this groundswell of excitement and bipartisan support. How do we take that and really come up with actionable plans? And that's, of course, John, very much what you just mentioned. And specifically what we're digging into is these questions of what are we conserving, where are we conserving it, how are we conserving it, which gets at the effectiveness issues that you just brought up, John. And then who is at the table in making these decisions? I'm going to very quickly just remind folks or introduce maybe to some folks who have less experience or knowledge with this 30 by 30 initiative, this concept of conserving 30% of Earth by the year 2030, where it comes from. And in fact, it has very deep roots and came from many different places, but it's often considered to be coalesced to some degree by what's called the Campaign for Nature, which is a partnership between the Wyss Foundation, which provided a gift of over $1 billion to the National Geographic Society to kick off this campaign. And it now includes several hundred nonprofit organizations. Dozens of countries have shown a willingness to sign on through the Convention for Biological Diversity. And as John said, it's now featured, will be featured in the upcoming CBD meetings, which had been scheduled for October in China. So a huge amount of international support. And of course, we've seen the same type of support. And of course, amid a lot of partisan stagnation and challenges, we've seen quite the contrary with the 30 by 30 initiative, including House bill introduced in February, and as well as 30 by 30 being featured in the platform of Joe Biden in his candidacy for president. And what we've seen in each of these cases, as well as we recently saw with the passage last week of the Great American Outdoors Act, is again surprising bipartisan support. And recent surveys have shown incredible public support for this idea, for example, whether it's in the Western states or across the US or internationally, for this 30% goal, this 30% conservation goal. And for those who are tuning in from California, of course, and many of you are probably, or some of you much more involved with this than I am, California has echoed or reflected this excitement and interest in 30 by 30. California Bill AB 3030, of course, named for the initiative, proposes to put the state on the same path as the region and as the country, and also to engage in national and international efforts. So we're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing this, again, across agencies, across nonprofits, across governments. And the real question is that as exciting as this initiative is, and the attention and energy that's going towards getting this goal written and adhered to, we face huge challenges with actually operationalizing it. And I tend to be a kind of nerd, the annoying nerd in the back of the room who raises his hand and says, this is fantastic, but how are we actually going to do this? And of course, I'm far from alone in that. And many of us have been asking and have been given a chance to work on efforts to resolve some of these big questions about what exactly are we trying to protect in a 30 by 30 initiative? Where are we protecting it? And then what are the actions we're taking? What are the strategies? How are we funding it? What are the benchmarks for success or effectiveness? And then very importantly, we're asking, as I'm sure many of you are, who is at the table for each of these decisions? And of course, this is critical, whether it's local, state, regional, federal, international, who is making these incredibly important decisions about how we're allocating billions of dollars. And that's not a hypothetical billions of dollars. Those are realized to some degree at this point. And so what is being prioritized? And there's, of course, an immense literature on this. And I just spent 6 months with a group of 30 amazing graduate students and young researchers identifying all the different ways that we are currently prioritizing what we protect. And of course, we have old systems of unique geology and hydrology that explain a lot of our most revered national parks, but also cultural values and tourism. And starting in about 2000, we saw an incredible emphasis, at least in the scientific literature, on how we might use this concept of biodiversity hotspots, which look at species richness and endemism and threat. And then also over the last 10 years in particular, we've seen real emphasis on moving beyond individual species or geological features and thinking about ecological processes, like how do we maintain migrations and connectivity across landscapes? How do we conserve or prioritize for the ecosystem services on which our economies and health depends? And then last, of course, a major feature of our conversation and of ongoing conversations is how do we prioritize for future climate scenarios, for future landscapes in which ecosystems are altered, and we are trying to instill or create resilience and resistance in those systems. So, fortunately, I guess, there are all sorts of products out there now. This is an example from a product called Zonation that allow smart people who are computer or GIS inclined to go through and think about how we might weigh a variety of these different priorities for conservation. And we could imagine scenarios, and this is happening, whether it's an NGO or a state agency or federal agencies or combinations, people gathering around the table, smart people gathering around the table, coming up with their priorities and then putting them through this process of prioritization and weighing, and then projecting this idealized landscape onto our area of choice. So for example, this is a prioritization of land areas for the conservation of birds in the state of California. So we can see how this goes, and there's a huge amount of sausage making in the middle there that is sort of kind of the heart of some of the challenges we really face. But even once we've identified, if we've come together, or the group at the table at least has come together on what is a priority, among the areas that are selected, what do we choose? How do we target among the many different, for example, priority areas for bird conservation in California? Where do we target that investment? And how do is that target going towards creating new protected areas, expanding current protected areas, increasing protection of current federal or state lands? Do we engage and include private lands from conservancies and conservation easements? And what is the role or engagement of tribal lands in all of this? And then that incredibly important and critical how question is, even after we've identified where, who has agency in this? How is it supported? And what is the model? How are we even defining protection? Because whether we get to 30% or not, very likely comes down to how or what we're able to call protected. could take an example from where I'm sitting today in the Bay Area of California, and we can just a quick look at the incredible diversity of land ownership and management tells us both, gives us a glimpse of the challenges and also opportunities for bringing together different strategies for conservation. And just adding conservation easements, private land conservation easements onto this map, which have not traditionally been included in our estimates of conserved land, gives us an even more complicated but also detailed idea or concept of what could be in many of these as we move forward in thinking about large landscape conservation. And this is essentially what many groups are proposing as they dig into these ideas. The Sierra Club basically says, look, there's a lot of land that's technically under some kind of protection. If we can increase that level of protection, we get to 30%. And then last, and again, I don't want to take us over too much, but who is at the table? And this is critically important. We have, of the 300 or so people on this webinar, what is this thing called? Anyway, this conversation today, I'm sure we have an incredible group representation of individuals from agencies, organizations, collectives, universities, and all the rest. And so who is at the table to determine what's conserved, where it's conserved, how it's conserved? And again, that's going to be critical in determining how successful we are. And then last, and this is at this point very preliminary, and my students will cringe, but can we look at how past the creation of protected areas over the last 20 years or so has been prioritized? And when we start to do that, what we see is that the science behind that is really not nearly as important or strong as we may think. And in fact, really a lot of conservation over the last 20 years has come down to opportunity. What is available, what's affordable, and what doesn't require moving a lot of people around. So that raises the question, if we're using a low-hanging fruit strategy for reaching 30 by 30, what does that look like? Is that a bad thing? Is that just realism? What does it mean for the US and California? So I'll stop there. I apologize for going over a little bit. But I look forward to the conversation, and I hope folks will feel comfortable contacting me.
Great. Thank you, John, for the invitation, and thanks to the over 270 people who have joined us today. In Yosemite National Park and around the world, published scientific research shows that human-caused climate change is killing trees, increasing wildfire, and even contributing to species extinctions. Of the numerous impacts today, I'm going to review the science on three main challenges of climate change to biodiversity conservation and three solutions. And of course, our point of departure is the existing global network of protected areas, which cover 15% of global terrestrial area. And this is very close to the existing target of 17%, as we see here, but only a third of the land actually has an assessment of the effectiveness. And we've been speaking about effectiveness, and right from the start, I will say that two important measures of effectiveness are the number of species conserved and the integrity of ecosystem function, wildfire, water provision, and other ecosystem level functions. But we see that only a third, this 5% doesn't even go into the measure of effectiveness. It's just saying that 5% have an assessment of it. And going forward, we have even more ambitious targets. We've been talking about 30 by 30. That is just one of 20 different action targets currently proposed. So, of course, the more area, the better, but we have a lot of other species and ecosystem level targets that we're aiming at. But today we're focusing on the area. As I mentioned, I'm going to go through 3 challenges and 3 solutions. And human sources, cars, power plants, deforestation, pump 11.5 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. And oceans, vegetation, natural ecosystems only have the capacity natural capacity to remove about 6 of that. So the remainder goes up into the atmosphere, and that's the fundamental imbalance that's causing climate change. It's raised atmospheric carbon dioxide to its highest level in 800,000 years. Consequently, the lands and waters around the world have heated up. This map is the result of research by colleagues and I. The darkest reds are an increase of over 2.5 degrees Celsius in a century. That's approximately 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And our analyses show that the national parks, the 419 national parks, the land area, is disproportionately exposed to increasing heat and increasing aridity. The rate of heating in the US national parks is twice that of the country as a whole, the 50 US states and territories. And zooming in, we see some of the highest increases in temperature have been in California, and actually we also see changes in precipitation that human-caused climate change is causing around the world. Generally an increase of precipitation that we see in the US national parks. Precipitation as a whole has decreased more than the US as a whole. And again, here in California, we see some of the most severe reductions in precipitation and increases in aridity. Continued climate change continues this even more severely into the future. And this map shows the worst case, the highest emission scenario, RCP 8.5, where annual average temperature can increase by over 10 degrees Celsius on the north slope of Alaska. That's 16 degrees Fahrenheit, an astounding increase in temperature. That's alarming, but that's the red bar here. But we see that the green bar, meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, could reduce heating by 1/2 to 2/3. Observations, published scientific research shows that human-caused climate change has contributed tragically to species extinctions. The golden toad in Costa Rica and other amphibian species due to climate change lifting the cloud deck in the Monteverde cloud forest there. And that's the most severe effect, but we also see local disappearance of species, such as this research from Steve Weisinger and colleagues in the Mojave Desert, where they found that bird species richness fell 40% in Mojave National Preserve, Death Valley National Park, Joshua Tree National Park, and other protected lands in Southern California. Continued climate change could increase the risk of animal and plant extinctions up to 5 times historical rates, including the polar bear, one of the few species listed under the US Endangered Species Act as threatened due to anthropogenic climate change. Climate determines the spatial patterns of vegetation globally, so climate change has been shifting vegetation at the biome level. Major vegetation formations, such as here in Fiordland National Park, where temperate bog forest temperate broadleaf forest is shifting upslope into subalpine shrubland. In Senegal, where my research showed in West Africa that human-caused climate change has shifted the savanna and woodland biomes south towards areas of higher rainfall. And in Yosemite National Park, where forest is shifting upslope into meadows. Published research has shown this around the world. And colleagues and I analyzed the future risks. So this is the distribution of biomes under current climate. And this is the worst case under climate change. So we see potential shifts of hundreds of kilometers, 1/7 of global land area. And when you include the fragmentation of the habitat due to agriculture and urbanization, half of global terrestrial area is at risk of these biome shifts. And then if only protected areas are considered as the intact ecosystems, less than 1% or 1 to 2% of global land area is refugia or potentially stable. So that's 98 to 99% at risk of these biome shifts. In addition, climate change intensifies the three factors that cause wildfire: heat, fuel, and ignition. So anthropogenic climate change has doubled wildfire across the western US compared to natural burning. And continued climate change could increase wildfire frequencies by up to 50% across 1/3 of global land. So the main solutions that have been developed so far, as Justin mentioned, a lot of research has shown that habitat connectivity benefits species, particularly species that whose ranges are shifting and will need space to shift into suitable climate. Another solution, which Justin mentioned, the main solution is then using climate change data spatially to prioritize areas. And Lee Hanna and colleagues here have prioritized new land areas for potential new land acquisition in the tropics using climate change. And for the National Park Service, I actually contributed climate change data, the biome shift data that you saw previously globally on the left, in the middle, ecosystem carbon density, into a proposal for new land acquisition in Northern California under the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So this is an operationalization of that black box that Justin showed, using climate change data to prioritize new land acquisition so we can meet 30 by 30. And another form of prioritization is conserving refugia for effective conservation under climate change. And Jane is going to talk about this example in Joshua Tree National Park. Forests and other ecosystems provide a natural solution to climate change by naturally removing carbon from the atmosphere. Here's in the Parque Nacional Yanachaca-Quemían in Peru, the Amazon rainforest. And biodiversity actually increases with vegetation carbon density. So we're actually covering two main benefits with one action. In California hosts the ecosystems with the highest carbon density in the world, the coast redwoods, up to 2,600 tons per hectare, 10 times the density in Amazon rainforest. And in fact, the 27 national parks in California store the equivalent of 1 year of carbon emissions from over 7 million Americans. Everybody in Boston, Charlotte, Los Angeles, all those cities. That sounds like a lot, 7 million Americans, but actually it's not a lot because there's only 1 year. So in 1 year, all those people can burn off all of the equivalent of all of the carbon in the giant sequoias and the coast redwoods and all of the other ecosystems. So this points to the need for reductions of emissions from fossil fuels. And in the United States, while the current administration has been attempting to suppress science and block action on climate change, 24 states and Puerto Rico have banded together in the US Climate Alliance, and they've cut their emissions 16% and are on track to meeting the Paris Agreement goals through renewable energy efficiency, and energy conservation. And in California, we've actually cut our emissions 14%, and we've achieved our goal 4 years early of reducing emissions to 1990 levels. And we're going to continue reducing. One of the main benefits of this is for biodiversity, is reducing animal and plant extinctions. So by meeting the Paris Agreement goals, we can reduce the potential extinctions by up to 2/3, and this directly this directly addresses one of the challenges of meeting the 30 by 30 goals for biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
And I'm gonna get myself off of mute. And thanks, Patrick, for your always inspiring conversations around this topic. And so as a manager of a national park, I wanted to kind of take us down, scale us down a little bit, and talk about what is possible, some opportunities at the local level for local land management, management of these high biodiversity areas. And obviously Joshua Tree, as both Justin and Patrick mentioned, looking at biodiversity hotspots in the continental US. Here we are at Joshua Tree National Park. Previously, deserts were not always considered a place of high biodiversity, but in fact, Joshua Tree presents a unique situation, somewhat similar to the Grand Canyon, where we have a broad range of elevational gradients. We have a number of mountain ranges that have both the influence of the Sonoran and Mojave deserts, and from the west, a Mediterranean influence. It really creates a spectacular assemblage that speaks to the biodiversity of this area. And really you can see that in the number of plant species, birds, mammals, and lizards that are represented across the landscape. And this landscape is quite expansive. It presents a place that does lend an opportunity for really broad, big, ambitious landscape scale management goals and objectives. But this landscape is stressed out, and we've got things like invasive species. Predominantly at Joshua Tree, our concerns are with non-native invasive annual grasses. You might be familiar with cheatgrass or red brown that have been invading from the west for some decades and centuries now. And unfortunately, these non-native grasses take advantage of pollutants like nitrogen deposition, which is quite common and unfortunately significant out here in the desert area, that serves to fuel and feed those invasive species that are spreading across the landscape. And these species are indeed altering the fire regime. We know over the last 30 plus years that fires in the Mojave, in our part of the Mojave, have increased in frequency and intensity in size. So we know that the fire regimes have changed in their impacts and implications for that. And you put on top of that things like drought, which we've been experiencing, as Patrick was describing, and even stressed out plants and animals leads to increased herbivory of keystone species, of course, increased temperatures. And so what is most vulnerable in this suite of stressed out landscapes? Where can we focus our energy? And about 5 years ago, the park embarked on collaborating with UC Riverside, park ecologists, to really take a look at, okay, we know that this very large, vast, complex area is subject to a number of stressors. Which ones are the most vulnerable? And as you can see in the diagram here, Joshua trees are really rising to that level. And you've got the park's namesake, you've got a species that many of our visitors and the public come here to see and enjoy and experience. And it is one of the most vulnerable species out on our landscape for the number of reasons that I just mentioned. So we know what's vulnerable, where to perhaps focus our energy, what species, what plant communities, what habitats. And where are they? How can we wrap our arms around this? How can we scale down to a management level and start thinking about what can we do as managers to better protect and preserve these hotspots of biodiversity? It's one thing to draw a boundary around a national park unit or public lands, as Patrick was mentioning, but how can we then manage within those boundaries to ensure the resilience of the biodiversity within those areas? So this map shows using modeling and our best available science. So we're continuing to review this regularly to improve our science and understanding, but we do have a good sense, as you see in the distribution here, of where Joshua trees might persist under various climate change scenarios. And the darkest area here would be under the most severe case scenarios for climate change. So that presents some opportunities for us to focus our efforts. Yes, the landscape is large. Yes, it is somewhat daunting, but here we can focus our energy on areas where we know we have our best available information to point at and say, hey, these could be locations where Joshua trees could survive, could be resilient with a 3°C change under future climate scenarios. And you can also see that there's some opportunity outside of our boundaries to partner with other conservation areas and really acknowledge that this is a broad landscape scale effort and issue. Well, okay, but how do we do that? And here we have a situation where, unfortunately, the refugia, which we've identified, overlaps with some of these large fires that I was talking about. So the lighter colored areas represent the fire history of the park, most of which those larger fires have occurred since the 1990s. So this points at an additional concern. We have an idea of where these refugia are. We have an idea of where we can protect and put our efforts, but a portion of that has already burned. And so now what? How can we hone in on what remains and best protect those areas in light of all the other stressors that we're trying to manage for? Well, let's prioritize. And ecologists in our team here at Joshua Tree worked hard to kind of hone in where we can focus our efforts. And let's look at where are there mature, healthy trees on the landscape? Where are we seeing evidence of recruitment? You can see in the foreground here next to the trail, there's a little young Joshua tree that has sprouted. Where's the shrub component present but not too thick if we're trying to really manage for fuels and large-scale wildland fire? And where do we have that high cover of cheatgrass or red brome that we're worried about? So using those criteria, we can then focus in further our efforts. And this is the latest, really hot off the press, where we're focusing some of our work in doing controlled fuels projects in these pink or darker highlighted areas along some of our trail networks to really create a holding line, to really find areas that we can preserve and protect by taking aggressive fuels management actions on those non-native fuels that can be driving future fires. We know that fire is not an if, but a when. How can we prepare for that rather than being reactive after the fact and having lost even more of our refugia? We recently have been partnering with volunteers and conservation corps to take a look at experimenting with doing some localized fuel treatments around some of these refugia islands. So the idea is, rather than after a fire coming back in and putting a lot of time, money, labor, effort into reseeding or replanting, maybe ahead of these fires, we can create these protected islands. Think of them much like fuels treatments where you're creating defensible space, this concept of defensible space around pockets of intact vegetation within these refugia that would be more adapted should and when a wildland fire comes through that area. And that's going to leave Joshua trees and some shrub component present to act as nurse plants and reseed those areas and keep those refugia in play. So some of the takeaways here, and I look forward to some questions and conversation as part of this webinar, are this notion of doing something. You know, it's very easy as a land manager, it could be easy to be overwhelmed by the number of stressors and challenges that we have, but we have to take action. This is not a time to simply give in to the challenges, but rather it's time to embrace that and really encourage risk-taking and innovation. And this involves empowering the staff and your partners to really start thinking creatively and differently than we may have in the past. What we're doing here at Joshua Tree is prioritizing our wildfire suppression to protect the Joshua Tree refugia. This is something different than we've done in the past. We're really focusing and collaborating with our fire management team and empowering them with GIS data that shows where the refugia are and where we really need to have aggressive initial attack and suppress fires within those very sensitive areas. So thinking about this as defensible space, it's a little bit different than one might think of in an urban interface where we might be protecting homes or communities, but here we're protecting a different type of a home and a different type of community. And one could argue that those should be on par. You know, these refugia, these hotspots of biodiversity should be our priorities about where we're focusing our protection efforts. And as I mentioned, you know, some creative thinking here in establishing seed or restoration islands well ahead of the future fire events, looking at fuel breaks and treatments to improve firefighting tactics, to be able to get fire response crews in there quicker, to be more aggressive. And then, of course, this is a long-term process. This is a long-term engagement where we are testing and monitoring and using adaptive management to try out new things, to partner with new partners that we may not have thought of before, and really trying to take action and preserve really why this park was established in the first place. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Patrick. Those were really three fantastic presentations. And they really fit together quite well. I think, Justin, you identified this very large global opportunity to rally behind the 30 by 30. Patrick gave us the challenges, but also some solutions to this, and Jane brought it down to the ground and showed us the practical applications of resource managers in the field that are really working to resolve some of these things. There have been some pretty good questions. I'll jump in early with just a quick note that the Great American Outdoors Act, which was just passed by Congress, fully funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million a year, which provides an opportunity for land acquisition to help us meet that 30 by 30 goal. The question is then, as Justin and everyone has posed, is, you know, what are the priorities in setting values on those to decide which lands should be acquired? And we can hope that maybe we can reconstitute something that was going on during the Obama administration, which was the 4 land management agencies, the Forest Service, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Park Service, got together annually and looked at large landscapes like the California desert or the Bitterroot area or the Chesapeake Bay, and decided as a group what the priority was for large landscape connectivity. And then we pooled our money. Of course, at the time, we didn't have much money. But with the new funding of LWCF, we can actually perhaps make a significant contribution. And often that money can be paired with philanthropic donations to achieve that. There were a couple of questions. One was for you, Patrick. Can you tell us what the total carbon sequestration is of the entire national park system? And I don't know whether we've calculated for the rest of the public land estate, but at least for the NPS, I think you know what that is.
Actually, that's an analysis that I would like to do.
Ah, okay.
And what you saw was the analysis. I've done that for the state of California, because California is one of the only jurisdictions in the world with mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And as you saw, I quantified that for all of the national parks in California, and it's, you know, as you saw, equivalent to 1 year of emissions from 7 million people. I suspect that protected areas globally conserve a substantial amount of carbon, and that is an analysis that remains to be done. And actually, I'd like to do it. I'd like to find time. There is some new data to help us do that.
Good. Well, maybe we can set that up. Justin, talk a little bit about how do we think that we can sort of use that 30 by 30 goal to really get countries around the entire world to sort of buy into this? Is it, I mean, it's sort of one metric, and is it enough, has enough power behind it to really bring together a world community around achieving this?
Yeah, so John, as you know well, and others do, it's a tough question and a tough challenge. And you've brought up before, and others, that, you know, we had goals for 2020 about conservation, about global conservation targets that weren't reached. And so it really does, I think a lot of folks are very reasonably asking, how is this different? How is 30 by 30 different? And I think it's different in a sense as far as the energy, as far as the number of groups involved. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, if we focus, for example, on the National Geographic and Wyss Foundation approach, which mirrors, I think, or has influenced a lot of approaches, in my assessment, it really comes out of what I call the Patagonia model, and that is looking at areas of very low human population density and where livelihoods have been altered dramatically through globalization, in this case, changes in sheep production and wool markets and all the rest, that create this opportunity for, in this case, philanthropists or philanthropy to come in and acquire large areas of land and devolve those areas to the state, essentially, for conservation. And I think that has influenced a lot of marine conservation. That's sort of a model, is to say, well, let's find places we can draw lines, big polygons on maps. And that, you know, that is happening, and some of it is through opportunity, some of it is through the public support for this, really. I mean, it's a win. You know, the Trump administration, prior to the world being turned upside down in March, had grasped the idea, or had come to the realization that reforestation was a win, was a huge political win. And so suddenly we started to see a lot of initiatives around reforestation. So, you know, the idea, there seems to be a lot of public support, bipartisan support, seems to be a lot of government interest. But, you know, if I had a simple answer to your question, as you can tell, I'd be, I don't know what I'd be doing, but, you know.
You're probably not this, right? You'd be solving these problems. Jane, a question, this was actually posed to the group, but how do you deal with a species that you know you're probably ultimately not going to be able to save within the boundaries of the park? You're sort of like, it's within its, you know, sort of the edges of its range anyway. And Patrick, you're welcome to jump in on this as well, or Justin. But, you know, we've talked about assisted migration issues, landscape connectivity, but here you are in a park with a boundary, and climate is moving and species are moving. And so how do you sort of deal with that as a resource manager?
Yeah, great question. you know, first and foremost, we really are having to talk outside of our boundaries more than ever, and really putting our public lands in the context of everything around us. So what role does Joshua Tree play in species conservation? And that helps inform us, you know, well, does it rise to that level of importance, or is this a priority compared to where the distribution is elsewhere? And if it is a critical location, an example here would be bighorn sheep. We're really a holdout, a stronghold for the genetic population of desert bighorn. And so while we're on that southwestern edge, it's sort of elevated the importance because of the genetic preservation we've got going on here in terms of looking at water availability. So we know some 40% of our springs have not had water in the last 10 years. Do parks begin considering supplemental watering? Well, that is anathema to why the parks were established, you know, and so we're starting to have to entertain ideas that maybe we would not have even you know thought of in the past. Second to that, real quick, is the desert tortoise, which of course is federally listed species. We're in a position where we could do population augmentation. Again, that is sort of a radical idea, but I think parks need to be open to these ideas for the greater good.
Great.
I add, again, basically two strategies, and Jane illustrated very well one of them, and that's conserving refugia within the existing range to the extent possible. And the second strategy she also spoke about, and I spoke about, is landscape scale conservation. And John, of course, you as director of the U.S. National Park Service really introduced and promoted the idea of the national parks as the core of a conservation landscape. And because of that, staff have really adopted that. And now U.S. national parks are developing resource stewardship strategies or master plans that include goals that actually say conserve a species within its potential range under climate change. So even if it isn't within the boundaries of a national park, the park considers it effective conservation if it's conserved in its neighbors under climate change. And that is a major change in strategy, and really thanks a lot to you, John, for emphasizing that and promoting that while you were director.
You know, this one of the other questions was about the engagement with states and local government, local private landowners, and I think that's absolutely essential. As a matter of fact, one of these conservation conversations is going to be specifically about the engagement of private lands. The University of Wyoming's presentation will be all about that, and I think that, as Justin pointed out in his maps, and Patrick as well, that we have to involve everybody if you're going to be involved in large landscape conservation. And the private landowner, or even the working lands, can be a significant contributor to biodiversity conservation. And it's really going to require us to build new relationships, new cooperative arrangements as well. Do you have any questions for each other that I didn't ask? So we're getting most of the ones that are coming off of our attendees. Well, I'll jump back in. We've only got a few minutes, and thinking about this as applied policy, a policy to change the way we are currently doing things, like managing the way we manage our protected areas and our public lands, to what new areas should be added and how they are decided and what values should be applied. These are all really policy questions. And so with each of you, as a kind of a closing comment, do you have any, if you could make one or two recommendations to the policymakers about addressing the conservation of biodiversity over the next 10 years, what would they be? And we'll start with you, Justin.
Okay, it's a big one. just in talking with lots of folks about this, I think it's an incredible opportunity to empower smaller sort of, this may be predictable that I'm here in Berkeley and I'm going to say give power to the little person, but that's really, I think there's a huge opportunity here to empower local groups, and whether they're land conservancies, conservation collectives, and others. And I actually think that's the way this is going to work. We've seen kind of how big top-down conservation works, and it'll work in some places, and we'll draw lots of lines on maps. But when you consider that fewer than 1/3 of all protected areas have any funding on our planet whatsoever, I think we need to look hard at effectiveness. And so I think that happens locally in small scale. Huge role for national parks, huge role for state parks and various others. But I think this is the opportunity, and that's what I'm pushing within the networks, and what little leverage I have is going towards saying, who are the local partners and how do we empower them?
Okay, great. Patrick?
Human-caused climate change touches every single part of the world and has the most extensive impact on biodiversity and ecosystem function, as you've seen through extinctions, through increases in wildfire, through massive shifts in biomes. So one of the most effective policies for conserving biodiversity is reducing carbon pollution. I've shown that the data shows that meeting the Paris Agreement goals can reduce the potential loss of species by up to 2/3. It can actually keep wildfire at its same level rather than increasing. So reducing carbon pollution can help save biodiversity and human well-being.
Okay. Jane, you get to bat cleanup here.
Well, now more than ever, I think during this, the pandemic has daylighted the interest and the need from the public for their public lands, to be outdoors and to experience these things. And I think our policy needs to reflect that not only are we in the business of providing the facilities that visitors need on public lands to enjoy them, but the lands themselves need to be on par with that investment. And so we need to somehow better balance our policy and translate that into real support for that, focusing our efforts on protecting these lands, on the conservation, as well as the infrastructure that, of course, we need.
That's really great. Well, I want to thank our panelists for excellent presentations and great ideas. I want to thank the Salazar Center and Dominique Gomez for hosting and helping us pull off the technology of all of this. And I really want to thank the hundreds of attendees that sat in. As we mentioned, this will be recorded, and we will follow up on your questions as well, with those that perhaps we did not get to. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to Dominique.
Thank you so much to everyone. Just want to highlight that our next conservation conversation will be Thursday, August 13th at the same time, and we will be talking about reframing conservation as an economic driver in rural communities. And with that, thank you all for joining. Patrick, John, Justin, Jane, thank you, and have a great afternoon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.